Imagine walking into a supermarket to buy your weekly groceries, right? But the floor you are standing on is actually a 19th century colonial police station.
Oh, yeah. Or, taking a selfie in front of a beautiful seaside restaurant, completely unaware that the building you were looking at was dismantled piece by piece and moved across an entire island to hide a history of brutal torture.
Exactly. Today, we are completely transforming the way you see a very famous district on the southern tip of Hong Kong Island. We're talking about Stanley, or as it was originally known, Check
It is so easy to consume a leisure destination without really processing the landscape around you. I mean, you go for the breezy beaches or the open-air markets, and you just assume the place is exactly what it appears to be on the surface.
But this specific peninsula is a masterclass in how history gets layered, sanitized, and sometimes entirely rewritten. So for this deep dive, we are working with a highly authoritative academic historical research dossier.
Right, a dossier dedicated to uncovering the true depth of this area. Because what tourists experience today is just a relaxing getaway is actually a site shaped by shifting empires, massive pirate confederations, profound wartime trauma, and literally disassembled historical architecture.
It's wild. Today, we are uncovering 5 intense historical stories, showing you the hidden in plain sight gems you can physically visit, and looking at what this one patch of land teaches us about empire, memory, and survival. Okay, let's unpack this.
Where do we start?
We have to start at the supposed beginning of British Hong Kong. And I say supposed because the standard colonial narrative implies that when the British arrived in 1841, Hong Kong was just, a barren, uninhabited rock waiting for civilization.
Right, which the historical record completely demolishes. I mean, in January 1841, Stanley was not some sleepy, empty beach. It was the largest, most active settlement on the entire island.
We're talking about roughly 2,000 residents, right?
Exactly. And these weren't just transient fishermen. You had distinct, deeply established communities. So there were the Hakka and Puti people who worked the agricultural land, and the Tanka people who dominated the maritime and fishing economy.
And they had, what, over 100 shops?
Over 100 shops and a massive, highly organized fleet of boats. It was a thriving, self-sustaining town long before any British ship dropped anchor.
But what really surprised me in the dossier is how the British initially reacted to it. Because they didn't start building on the northern shore, where the famous gleaming skyline of Central is today.
No, they didn't. Because of its size and its flat coastline, the British actually chose Stanley to be their first temporary administrative capital.
Which is crazy to think about.
It is, and it highlights how reactive and fragile early colonial planning actually was. It wasn't some grand masterstroke of imperial foresight. The northern shore in 1841 was an absolute nightmare for the British.
Because of the disease, right.
Yeah, it was plagued by malaria, which was just decimating their troops. And on top of that, a typhoon had literally just flattened their temporary encampments.
So they looked south to Stanley, saw a healthy, functioning town with a built-in labor force of thousands, and just desperately adapted to the environment.
Exactly.
It's essentially like discovering that Manhattan wasn't originally supposed to be the center of New York, but rather some distant coastal suburb was meant to be the capital, simply because the mosquito situation was slightly less annoying there.
That is a perfect analogy. And their reliance on the local population went even deeper. I mean, the British didn't even map the northern shore on their own.
Wait, really?
Yeah, colonial archives reveal that a local tanka guide, a man named Quinn, actually led the British forces over the mountain passes to survey the area that would eventually become central.
So indigenous knowledge literally paved the way for the empire.
It entirely shatters that foundational colonial myth of the barren island.
And we also need to correct the record on the name of the area. The indigenous name is Chek Chu. But for a long time, there was this lingering myth that the name translated to robber's lair.
Right, basically branding the local population as a bunch of criminals and pirates.
Which is pretty convenient for colonizers to say.
Very convenient. But that theory relies on a very specific Hakka dialect interpretation. And the problem with that is historical chronologies prove the Hakka people didn't migrate in large numbers to that specific area until much later.
So what does the name actually mean?
Well, the far more credible, and frankly much more beautiful origin, comes from the landscape itself. Chek Chu likely refers to the majestic red cotton trees that used to blanket the area.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when they were in full bloom, their massive red flowers made the trunks look like towering red pillars.
Red pillars. I love that imagery. And then, of course, the British arrived and just slapped the name Stanley on the whole peninsula to honor Lord Stanley.
Right, a British politician back in London who never even set foot in Hong Kong.
Classic. But hey, If you are walking through Stanley today and want to touch this lost capital era, you can still visit the old Stanley police station.
Built in 1859.
Yes, making it one of the oldest colonial buildings left. But this goes back to my first point bizarrely. It currently functions as a supermarket. You can go buy a carton of milk while surrounded by the original 19th century colonial tiles.
It is the ultimate example of how this landscape constantly repurposes its past for modern convenience.
Yeah.
Oh, and you could also visit the Stanley Military Cemetery, which dates all the way back to 1841.
Actually predating the official ceding of the island to the British.
Exactly.
But we need to step back even further, because while the British planted their flag in 1841, just a few decades prior, the waters surrounding Stanley were controlled by an entirely different, vastly more powerful empire.
A pirate confederation?
Yes. And when we talk about pirates in this era, we aren't talking about a couple of rogue ships harassing merchants. We are talking about the Red Flag Fleet.
Led by the legendary female commander Cheung Po and her adopted son, who is a brilliant military tactician, Cheung Po Tsai.
The sheer scale of this pirate confederation is staggering.
It really is. At its height, between 1805 and 1809, the Red Flag Fleet had between 40,000 and 80,000 members.
That is massive.
Counting up to 1,800 ships. To put that in perspective, they absolutely dwarfed the famous Spanish Armada. They completely dominated the South China Sea coastline.
It was essentially a floating state. They controlled the waters so thoroughly that the mighty British East India Company couldn't defeat them militarily.
No, they couldn't.
The future colonizers of Hong Kong literally had to negotiate truces and buy safe passage just to sail through the area. But wait, hold on. I understand extorting the British, but I read in the dossier that Cheung Po Tsai wasn't just raiding coastal towns.
Far from it.
He actually funded and built several public Tin Hau temples along the coast, including the one right in Stanley. A pirate commanding 80,000 outlaws is building public temples.
Yeah, he was.
Wouldn't the King government notice a massive, wanted criminal funding a construction project right on the coast? How did he get away with that? Isn't that basically like a mafia boss donating to the local parish to buy the town's silence?
It is exactly like that. It's a brilliant strategy that sociologists call local embedding. Think about the logistics here. How do you physically feed and supply 80,000 outlaws?
I mean, you can't steal everything. Eventually, you run out of victims.
Right. You need a sustainable supply chain. These pirate fleets couldn't exist in a vacuum. They needed the local coastal villages to repair their ships, sell them rice and gunpowder, and crucially, not report their movements to the King Imperial Navy.
So, by building and funding temples dedicated to Tin Hau, the goddess of the sea, Cheung Po Tsai is basically acting like a legitimate patron of the community.
Religion was the social infrastructure these outlaws used to gain legitimacy. The King government couldn't easily crack down on a temple that the entire local fishing community relied on for spiritual protection.
Even if a pirate paid for the bricks.
Exactly. And his strategy completely worked. He became so powerful and entrenched that the King government eventually realized they couldn't beat him, so they co-opted him.
Wow, they hired him.
Yeah, he accepted a pardon and was made an official naval officer.
That is incredible. And if you go to Stanley today, you can visit that exact Tin Hau temple he funded. Built in 1767, it is the oldest of its kind in Hong Kong.
And as a bizarre side note, if you walk inside, you will see the skin of what is rumored to be the last tiger ever shot in Hong Kong hanging on the wall.
Which has absolutely nothing to do with pirates, but it is an incredible hidden gem.
For sure. And it's just a short walk away in Ma Hang Park is the Pak Tai Temple. That one was built in 1805 directly into the sea cliffs facing the ocean.
And local legend insists there used to be a sealed tunnel inside that led directly to Cheung Po Tsai's hidden pirate treasure.
Which is such a fun tourist story.
Yeah.
But it also highlights something a bit troubling. Today, pop culture in Hong Kong heavily romanticizes Cheung Po Tsai.
Right, he's portrayed in movies and theme parks as this swashbuckling Robin Hood figure.
Which conveniently erases the massive violence, extortion, and terror his fleet inflicted on coastal civilians who didn't cooperate. It's a classic case of collective memory, filtering out the trauma to create a more palatable, heroic narrative that sells tickets.
Yeah. But, some trauma is so profound and documented that it cannot be filtered out. In 1941, the narrative of Stanley shifts from romanticized pirates to the grim, undeniable reality of World War II.
And this chapter completely shatters the myth of European invincibility in Asia.
We are talking about the Battle of Hong Kong, specifically the events surrounding what is known as Black Christmas.
Right, December 25th, 1941.
During the battle, Japanese troops breached St. Stephen's College in Stanley. At the time, the college had been converted into a field hospital for wounded Allied soldiers.
British, Canadian, and Indian soldiers.
When the Japanese soldiers forced their way in, two doctors, Dr. Black and Dr. Whitney, bravely tried to step in front of them to protect the patients.
And it was just horrific. Both doctors were murdered on the spot, and the soldiers then moved through the wards, bayoneting wounded soldiers directly in their beds.
It is a harrowing, heavily documented war crime. And it occurred just hours before the British officially surrendered the entire colony. From that moment, Stanley's functions shifted entirely.
The battlefield was converted into a brutal civilian internment camp. For 44 agonizing months, roughly 2,800 non-Chinese men, women, and children were packed into the Stanley internment camp.
And the conditions were designed to be horrific, weren't they?
They were. The Japanese High Command operated on an explicit policy of providing only the minimum standard of living necessary for baseline survival. Deliberate starvation diets. Diseases like beriberi and dysentery were rampant.
And they subjected many to solitary confinement.
Yeah, cramped, unventilated spaces. But despite all that, what is truly remarkable is the hidden mechanisms of resistance that emerged within those confines.
This is where the story pivots from pure victimhood to incredible resilience. The colonial secretary, Sir Franklin Gimson, was imprisoned there.
And instead of just trying to survive the day-to-day, he began secretly planning the resumption of British administrative rule from inside the camp.
But how does someone physically manage a geopolitical strategy while starving to death in captivity?
Gimson was playing an incredibly dangerous long game. He held secret council meetings with other interned officials. He knew that whenever the war ended, there would be an immediate power vacuum in Hong Kong.
Right.
And he was terrified that the Americans, under FDR, might try to hand Hong Kong over to Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists to end British imperialism in the region.
So Gimson was organizing a shadow government so that the moment the Japanese surrendered, he could preempt the Americans and immediately assert British sovereignty.
Exactly, before anyone else could claim the territory.
It's staggering foresight. But the detail that really grounds all of this in profound humanity for me is how the prisoners chose to mourn their dead. They had absolutely no tools or materials. So prisoners would secretly venture into the ruins of nearby 19th century colonial fortresses.
These scavenged heavy blocks of granite from the rubble of the empire and spent countless hours hand-carving tombstones for their fallen friends.
They literally carved their dignity out of the wreckage.
And you can still see those very stones today. The military cemetery in Stanley is a globally significant space of shared multinational trauma.
It's powerful.
It is. And if you understand the broader historical context, this era did more than just inflict suffering. It completely destroyed the illusion of imperial supremacy.
Because for a century, the British had projected an aura of invincible, racialized superiority across Asia.
Exactly. Seeing those colonial masters defeated, humiliated, and imprisoned completely broke the spell. It was a catalyst that fueled post-World War II decolonization movements all across the globe.
If you walk past St. Stephen's College today, you'll actually hear kids playing. It's an active school again, which feels almost surreal.
Life goes on.
Yeah. But right on the grounds is St. Stephen's Chapel, built after the war. If you go inside, there is a hauntingly beautiful stained glass window showing emaciated prisoners of war and children praying behind barbed wire.
It is a rare space where the architecture itself serves as a direct, unblinking memorial to what happened on that exact soil.
It's a space where dark history is respectfully preserved in its original context. But that brings us to a fascinating contrast.
Oh, here we go.
Because just a few streets away, we see exactly what happens when a hyper-capitalist city decides that its uncomfortable colonial history is simply in the way of progress. Here's where it gets really interesting.
You're talking about Murray House.
I am. We've talked about preserving dark history, but how does a city like Hong Kong deal with a building that has a history of torture when that building happens to sit on billions of dollars of prime real estate?
Well, they literally take it apart like Lego bricks and exile it to the beach.
Let's talk about this Frankenstein building.
So Murray House was originally constructed in 1844, right in the political and commercial heart of Central on the Northern Shore. For over a century, it was a magnificent example of Victorian-era colonial architecture.
Massive stone columns, sweeping verandas.
Designed to project imperial authority. But during World War II, the Japanese military police, the Kembe, commandeered it as their headquarters.
And it became a notorious site for brutal interrogations, torture, and executions of resistance fighters.
The history was so intensely dark that after the war, they actually had to bring in Buddhist monks to perform exorcisms on the building.
Because government officials were terrified to work inside it?
Exactly. So fast forward to 1982. The land it sits on in Central is incredibly valuable. The government wants to clear the site to build the iconic modern Bank of China Tower.
But Murray House is a Grade 1 historical building, and Grade 1 is supposed to be the highest level of heritage protection in Hong Kong, meaning every brick is deemed historically vital.
So what do? They carefully dismantle it. They cataloged over 3,000 individual heavy stone blocks and just put them in storage in a government depot.
For 20 years.
It literally sat in boxes for 2 decades while bureaucrats argued about what to do with it. Some stones were actually lost or damaged over that time.
And then finally, in 2002, they decided to, quote-unquote, rebuild it in Stanley, miles away from its original context. But they didn't really rebuild it, did they?
No, they didn't.
So they literally just used 19th century colonial stones as, like, wallpaper.
It's like taxidermy for architecture. They poured a modern, structurally sound concrete building and then basically just glued the old stones to the outside of it to make it look old.
You take a building from the political heart of the city, strip away its dark history of war and torture, and dump it in a sunny tourist zone just to provide a colonial vibe for seaside dining.
And heritage conservation experts were absolutely scathing about this. One called it a Frankenstein creation, stitching together dead parts to make something that looks alive but possesses no soul.
It was entirely stripped of its historical context.
And as a result, it actually lost its Grade 1 heritage status. The relocation of Murray House is the ultimate metaphor for the commodification of colonial history.
The dark, brutal parts are sterilized so the facade can be easily consumed by tourists looking for romanticized charm.
Real estate logic completely defeated cultural heritage logic.
And the ultimate irony is, it didn't even work as a real estate venture. The new Murray House in Stanley is currently sitting largely empty as a failed retail space.
If you visit it today, get close to the walls. Look at the mismatched stone joints. You can actually see the modern concrete core peeking through the gaps.
And if you go to Central, where it used to stand, and witness so much suffering, there is no meaningful plaque, no memory, just gleaming modern bank buildings.
It is a sterilized fake relic. But just down the road from this fake facade in Stanley, there's a monument to state violence that they couldn't hide.
Because they were still actively using it.
Exactly. A massive, fully functioning instrument of state control that has witnessed the actual unvarnished changing of the guard over the last century.
Yes, we have to talk about the towering, oppressive walls of Stanley Prison. When it opened in 1937, it was aggressively touted as the most modern, civilized prison in the entire British Empire.
It was designed on strict 19th century utilitarian principles. It was supposed to be a perfectly efficient machine for reforming prisoners through discipline.
But just 4 years after it opened, the Japanese occupied Hong Kong and immediately reversed its function.
The civilized British prison was used by the Japanese to lock up, interrogate, and torture their enemies. It perfectly illustrates how any architecture built for state control can seamlessly be turned against its own creators.
And after the war, the British took it back, and it became the site of the ultimate state violence. Between 1946 and 1966, 122 people were hanged at Stanley Prison.
Which brings up a really interesting point about the timeline.
Right, wait a minute. The last hanging was in 1966, but the death penalty wasn't legally abolished in Hong Kong until 1993.
That's right.
Why would a government keep capital punishment on the books for 27 years without ever actually pulling the lever?
That 27-year gap is incredibly revealing about the political fragility of the late colonial era. The British government back in London had already abolished the death penalty in 1965.
Okay.
And there was growing humanitarian pressure locally to follow suit. But the colonial administration in Hong Kong was terrified.
Why?
They were managing a massive, rapidly growing population, and they were afraid of appearing weak or losing their ultimate tool of deterrence. So they kept the law on the books purely as a symbol of absolute power.
They were too politically constrained to actually execute anyone, but they needed the threat to exist.
It was the ghost of the hangman keeping people in line.
Wow. And speaking of the changing of sovereign power, there is an incredible physical transition right next door to the prison.
There is. After the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from Britain back to China, the nearby Stanley Fort transitioned directly from a British military garrison into a base for the People's Liberation Army.
It is the ultimate embodied architectural proof of Hong Kong's shift in sovereignty.
Think about the continuity here. A massive prison built to enforce colonial law seamlessly transitioned through Japanese occupation, back to British rule, and finally into the post-1997 era.
The fact that the PLA quietly took over the military fort right down the road is a physical manifestation of a new sovereign power claiming the exact same strategic geography the empire once held.
Hidden right there in the landscape.
Right.
Obviously, you can't walk inside the active prison or the PLA base as a tourist.
Right, but you can stand under the towering outer walls of Stanley Prison, and right next door is the Free Correctional Services Department Museum.
Which is a hidden gem that openly documents all of this, the colonial penal history, the execution records, all the uncomfortable realities.
It's wild that you can go from buying ice cream on the boardwalk to looking at the official logs of 122 hangings in a 5-minute walk.
And that precise juxtaposition is exactly what makes Stanley so vital to understand.
So what does this all mean? We've explored a district that has repeatedly served as a vital center and then been tossed aside as a periphery.
We've seen how this one small peninsula is a place where pirate empires bought local loyalty with temples,
Where the myth of European invincibility was shattered,
where starving POWs carved their own dignity out of stone.
and where uncomfortable history was literally disassembled and glued back together like wallpaper to make way for high finance.
If we connect all of these stories to the bigger picture, it reminds us that the landscapes we walk through every day are carefully curated. They are edited by whoever holds power.
They really are.
So I want to leave you with a question to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Look around your own city. What dark histories or uncomfortable realities have been quietly dismantled, moved, or sanitized in your hometown to make way for a more comfortable, consumer-friendly narrative?
It really makes you look at every old building and every street name just a little bit differently. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the landscapes around you, and we will catch you next time.